I pulled into the parking lot of Nightwatch Convenience at 10:47 p.m., 3 minutes before my shift was supposed to start. The building sat alone at the edge of a commercial strip that had seen better days, its fluorescent lights casting harsh white rectangles across the cracked asphalt. A few other businesses flanked it, a laundromat that looked permanently closed, and a pizza place with boarded windows. But the convenience store seemed to be the only thing still breathing in this corner of Portland's outskirts. Gary Peterson met me at the front entrance, keys jingling as he unlocked the door. He looked like every convenience store manager I'd ever seen. Tired eyes, a polo shirt with the company logo, and the general demeanor of someone who'd been working nights for too long. David, right. He held the door open, and I stepped inside. The store felt bigger than it looked from outside, with aisles that stretched back further than expected. Every surface gleamed under the fluorescent lights, like the place had just been scrubbed clean. Welcome to Nightwatch. Hope you're ready for a quiet job. I followed him to the counter area, noticing how the store felt oddly muffled. The usual sounds you'd expect, traffic from the street, the hum of refrigeration units, seemed dampened somehow. Quiet's good, I said, setting my jacket behind the register. I need something low-key while I figure out what's next. Gary nodded and reached under the counter, pulling out a folded piece of paper. The handwriting on it looked deliberate, like someone had taken time to make each letter clear. Before we get into the register training and all that standard stuff, I need you to read this. He handed me the paper. These are the rules for working here. They're not suggestions. I unfolded the paper, expecting the usual employee handbook stuff about punctuality and customer service. Instead, I found 6 numbered items, written in what looked like blue pen. 1. If a customer looks exactly like you, tell them we're closing and ask them to leave immediately. 2. Always help the elderly woman who can't reach the high shelves, no matter how many times she comes in. 3. Never make eye contact with the man in the brown hat. Stay silent until he leaves. 4. If you hear beeping sounds with no customers present, go to the storage room and wait there until I arrive. 5. If a child asks if you're hungry, always answer no. 6. The storage room is your safe space. If anything goes wrong, lock yourself inside and wait for me. I looked up at Gary, waiting for him to crack a smile or tell me this was some kind of hazing ritual. His expression stayed completely serious. I know how it sounds, he said, but these rules will keep you alive. Follow them exactly. No exceptions, no matter how crazy they seem in the moment. This is a joke, right? I held up the paper. Mirror customers, a hungry child, come on. Gary stepped closer, and something weird happened. When I glanced away from his face to look at the rules again, I couldn't quite remember what he looked like. His features seemed to slide away from my memory the second I wasn't staring directly at him. Do I look like I'm joking? His voice carried a weight that made the back of my neck prickle. This place isn't like other stores, David. Follow the rules, do your job, and you'll be fine. Break them. He shrugged. Well, let's just say you won't get a second chance. I folded the paper and slipped it into my back pocket. The rational part of my brain insisted this was all elaborate nonsense, but something about the empty store and Gary's complete lack of humor made me want to take it seriously anyway. Gary spent the next hour showing me the basics, how to work the register, where the supplies were kept, the layout of the storage room in the back. Everything seemed normal enough, except for the way he kept emphasizing that storage room. He showed me how the lock worked from the inside, made me practice opening and closing it, Even had me sit inside for a minute, so I'd know what to expect. "The night shift can get weird," he said as we walked back to the front. "People do strange things in the middle of the night. But as long as you follow the rules, you'll be fine." He left at midnight, on the dot, locking the door behind him, and leaving me alone in the too bright, too quiet store. I settled behind the counter with a textbook from one of my classes, figuring I'd get some reading done between customers. The first few hours crawled by. A woman in scrubs came in around 12:30, bought a pack of cigarettes and an energy drink, paid without making conversation, and left. An hour later, a man in a work uniform grabbed coffee and a sandwich from the hot food section. He seemed tired, moved slowly, counting out exact change before heading back into the night. Normal customers, normal interactions. I started to relax, convinced that Gary's rules were just his way of messing with the new guy. Then, around 2 a.m., the door chimed again. An elderly woman shuffled in, moving slowly with the careful steps of someone whose joints didn't work like they used to. She wore a faded cardigan and carried a small purse clutched in both hands. Nothing about her seemed unusual, but something made me reach for the folded paper in my pocket. She made her way to the canned goods aisle, and I watched her examine the shelves. She reached up toward a can of soup on the third shelf, straining to get her fingers around it. Her movements looked genuinely difficult, like the can might as well have been on the moon. Rule 2 flashed in my mind. Always help the elderly woman who can't reach the high shelves, no matter how many times she comes in. I left the counter and walked over to her. "Need help with that?" She turned to me with a smile that seemed too knowing for the simple interaction. "Oh, thank you, dear. These old bones just aren't what they used to be." I grabbed the can of soup and handed it to her. She held it for a moment, then looked up at me with eyes that seemed sharper than they should have been. "You're very kind," she said. "Not everyone would help an old woman." "No problem." I waited for her to head toward the register, but instead she set the can back on the shelf. "Actually, I don't think I need this tonight." She patted my arm gently. "But thank you for being so helpful." She shuffled back toward the front of the store, and I followed at a distance. Instead of buying anything, she pushed through the door and disappeared into the parking lot. I watched through the windows as she walked away, but the streetlights made it hard to track her movement. One moment she was there, the next she'd vanished into the darkness. I stood at the counter, staring at the empty parking lot and trying to process what had just happened. The interaction felt normal on the surface, but something about it left me unsettled. The way she'd looked at me when I helped her, like she was evaluating something. The fact that she'd asked for help and then left without buying anything. The rest of my shift passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just experienced something important. Every shadow in the parking lot seemed like it might be hiding someone watching the store. Every sound from the street made me look up from my textbook. When Gary returned at 6 a.m. to relieve me, I wanted to ask him about the elderly woman, but when I tried to describe what had happened, it felt foolish. An old lady had asked for help reaching a can of soup. I'd helped her. She'd left without buying anything. In daylight, it seemed like nothing at all. "Good first night," Gary said as I gathered my things. "Any problems?" I almost mentioned the woman, then decided against it. "No problems. Pretty quiet." Gary nodded, but I caught something in his expression, approval, maybe, or relief, like he'd been expecting a different answer. I drove home as the sun came up, but I couldn't stop thinking about the rules in my pocket, about the way Gary's face seemed to slip from my memory, about the elderly woman's knowing smile, and the can of soup she'd left behind. Something was fundamentally wrong with night watch convenience, and I had a feeling my quiet night job was going to be anything but quiet. I parked in the same spot as the night before, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. The folded piece of paper with Gary's rules had spent the day in my wallet, and I'd pulled it out 3 times to reread it. Each time, the words looked more ridiculous in daylight. Mirror customers, a hungry child, a man in a brown hat who shouldn't be looked at directly. Gary met me at the entrance again, keys ready. He looked exactly the same as the night before, though I couldn't quite pin down what that meant. When I tried to focus on his features, they seemed to shift slightly, like trying to remember a dream. "Second night," he said, unlocking the door. "How'd you sleep?" "Fine." I followed him inside, noticing again how the store felt insulated from outside noise. "Had some weird dreams though." He nodded, as if this was expected. "That happens sometimes. Your mind's processing new information." He walked to the counter and checked something on the register. "Any questions about the rules?" I wanted to ask about the elderly woman, about whether she was real or some kind of test, but in the harsh fluorescent lighting, those questions felt childish. "No questions." Gary handed me the keys and headed for the door. "Remember what I told you. Follow them exactly." He left me alone in the pristine stillness of night watch convenience. I settled behind the counter with a different textbook, determined to treat this like any other night job. The first hour passed quietly. A trucker stopped for coffee and beef jerky around midnight. A woman in a hospital uniform bought cigarettes and aspirin at 12:30. Normal people doing normal things. By 1 a.m., I'd started to relax. Maybe Gary's rules were just his way of dealing with the isolation and boredom of night shifts. People developed strange habits when they worked alone for too long. Then the door chimed again. A customer walked in, and every rational thought I'd built up over the past hour crumbled instantly. The person moving through the entrance looked exactly like me. Not similar, not close enough to be a relative, identical. Same height, same build, same facial features arranged in precisely the same way. Even his clothes matched mine. Jeans, a black t-shirt, sneakers that looked like they'd been bought from the same store. He walked toward the counter with measured steps, and I fumbled for the rules in my back pocket. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper, though I already knew what the first rule said. If a customer looks exactly like you, tell them we're closing and ask them to leave immediately. The doppelganger stopped in front of the register and stared at me. His eyes were the worst part. They looked like mine, completely empty, like someone had scooped out everything that made them human and left only the shape behind. "We're closing," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I need to ask you to leave." He didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't even breathe in a way I could detect. He just stood there, studying me with those hollow eyes like he was memorizing every detail of my face. "Sir, we're closed." I tried again, louder this time. "You need to leave the store." Still nothing. He tilted his head slightly, and the movement looked mechanical, like a doll being positioned by invisible hands. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the hum of the refrigeration units and the fluorescent lights overhead. My heart hammered against my ribs as I backed away from the counter. The storage room. Gary had shown me the storage room, made me practice locking it from the inside. Rule 6 said it was my safe space. I turned and ran toward the back of the store, not caring how it looked or what the doppelganger might think. The storage room door stood open, and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut and twisting the lock with trembling fingers. The metallic click felt like the most important sound I'd ever heard. I pressed my back against the door and tried to control my breathing. The storage room was small and cramped, filled with boxes of inventory and cleaning supplies. A single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast harsh shadows into every corner. I checked my watch, 1:47 a.m. Footsteps echoed from the main store area, slow, deliberate steps that moved from aisle to aisle with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. The sound of shoes on linoleum carried clearly through the thin walls, and I tracked the movement as it circled the store again and again. The footsteps paused near the storage room door. I held my breath, listening to silence that felt heavier than the sound had been. Something scraped against the door, fingernails, maybe, or the edge of a coin. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then the footsteps resumed their circuit of the store, around and around, past the beverage coolers, through the snack aisles, behind the counter where I should have been standing. I sat on a box of paper towels and waited, counting each loop and wondering what would happen if I opened the door. My watch showed 2:15 when the footsteps finally stopped, but I waited another 5 minutes before carefully unlocking the door and cracking it open. The store looked exactly as I'd left it, fluorescent lights buzzing over empty aisles, no sign of the doppelganger anywhere. I walked back to the counter on shaking legs, checking every aisle and corner. The front door showed no signs of forced entry. The register hadn't been touched. Nothing was missing or out of place. But the air felt different somehow, like the space had been contaminated by something that didn't belong there. I tried to focus on my textbook, but the words kept blurring together. Every sound from outside made me look up. Every shadow seemed like it might be hiding another copy of myself, waiting for the right moment to walk back through the door. Around 3:30 a.m., I heard the familiar shuffle of careful footsteps. The elderly woman from the previous night pushed through the entrance, moving with the same fragile care as before. She wore different clothes, a blue sweater instead of the cardigan, but everything else about her looked identical. She made her way to the cereal aisle this time, reaching up toward a box of oatmeal on the 4th shelf. Her movements looked genuinely strained, and I found myself walking over before I'd consciously decided to help. "Need a hand with that?" She turned to me with the same knowing smile. "Oh, you're such a dear. These old bones just don't work like they used to." I grabbed the box of oatmeal and handed it to her. She held it for a moment, examining the label like she'd never seen oatmeal before. "Perfect," she said. "This is exactly what I needed." But instead of heading to the register, she set the box back on the shelf. Then she moved toward the door with surprising speed, covering the distance in half the time her shuffle should have allowed. I blinked, and she was gone, disappeared into the parking lot like smoke. I stood in the cereal aisle, staring at the box of oatmeal she'd returned to the shelf. The interaction had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt significant in a way I couldn't explain, like I'd passed some kind of test without understanding what was being evaluated. The rest of the night crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every customer who didn't come through the door felt like a small victory. Every minute that passed without strange sounds or impossible visitors was a gift. I found myself checking the rules obsessively, reading them over and over until I had all 6 memorized. By 5:30 a.m., I was starting to believe I might make it through the shift without any more incidents. The sky outside was beginning to lighten, and Gary would be here soon to relieve me. I allowed myself to relax slightly, leaning back in the chair behind the register. That's when I heard the beeping. It sounded exactly like a checkout scanner, sharp electronic chirps that came in regular intervals, but I was the only person in the store, and I wasn't scanning anything. I looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Rule 4 crashed into my consciousness. If you hear beeping sounds with no customers present, go to the storage room and wait there until I arrive. I ran for the back of the store, not bothering to lock the register or turn off any lights. The beeping followed me, growing louder and more frequent with each step. By the time I reached the storage room, it sounded like a dozen scanners operating at once, creating a chaotic symphony of electronic noise. I slammed the door and locked it, then sat on the same box of paper towels I'd used earlier. The beeping continued outside, rising and falling in waves that made no sense. Sometimes it would stop for long stretches, making me think it was over, then resume with doubled intensity. I checked my watch every few minutes, watching the hands crawl towards 6 a.m. At 5:52, the beeping stopped completely. At 5:58, I heard Gary's key in the front door. "David," his voice carried clearly through the store. "Everything okay?" I unlocked the storage room and walked out to meet him. He stood by the counter, looking exactly as calm and unflappable as always. The store showed no signs of the chaos I'd experienced, no evidence of beeping scanners or mysterious customers. "I heard the beeping," I said. Rule 4. I went to the storage room, like you said. Gary nodded, as if this was perfectly normal. "Good, you handled everything correctly." He walked to the register and began his opening routine, checking the cash drawer and turning on additional lights. Any other incidents? I thought about the doppelganger, about 30 minutes of footsteps circling the store while I hid in a storage room, about the elderly woman's impossible speed and knowing smile. "A few things," I said, "but I followed the rules. That's what matters." Gary looked up from the register, and for a moment his face seemed more solid, more real than usual. "The rules aren't suggestions, David. They're the only thing keeping you safe. Follow them exactly, no matter how strange things get." I nodded and gathered my jacket from behind the counter. The morning sun was streaming through the windows now, making everything look normal and mundane. But I couldn't forget the hollow eyes of my doppelganger, or the sound of footsteps circling the store like a predator. "Same time tomorrow?" Gary asked. I almost said no, almost told him I was done, that I'd find another job somewhere that didn't require rules about mirror customers and hungry children. But something held me back. Curiosity, maybe, or the need to understand what was really happening at Nightwatch Convenience. "Yeah," I said. "Same time." I walked to my car through the normal morning light, but I could feel Gary watching me from inside the store. When I turned back at my car door, he was standing at the window with an expression I couldn't read. His face looked clearer in the daylight, more defined, like the sun had given him substance he lacked at night. I drove home, thinking about rules and tests, about the difference between what seemed real and what actually was. Tonight I'd followed Gary's instructions exactly, and I'd survived whatever was happening in that store. But I had a feeling that surviving was only the beginning. The rules weren't just keeping me safe, they were keeping something else contained. And tomorrow night, I'd be back to find out what that something was. 12 hours. That's all the time I'd given myself, between walking out of Nightwatch Convenience and walking back in. My body felt heavy from lack of sleep, and my mind kept replaying yesterday's events. The doppelganger's hollow stare, the beeping that came from nowhere, the elderly woman's impossible speed. I should have called in sick, should have found an excuse to stay home, and apply for jobs at normal places that didn't require memorized rules about mirror customers and hungry children. But something pulled me back, to that fluorescent-lit building, sitting alone among the abandoned storefronts. Gary met me at the entrance with the same routine as always, though I caught something different in his expression when he handed me the keys. Relief, maybe, or approval. "Third night," he said. "You're starting to get the hang of this." I wanted to ask him what exactly I was getting the hang of, but he left before I could form the question. The lock clicked behind him, sealing me inside the too-bright store with its muffled silence and endless aisles. The first 2 hours crawled by with normal customers, a delivery driver grabbing energy drinks, a woman buying cigarettes and lottery tickets. Each time the door chimed, my muscles tensed automatically. Each face that walked through the entrance got a careful examination, checking for impossible resemblances or familiar features. By 2 a.m., my paranoia had reached exhausting levels. Every shadow in the parking lot might be hiding someone waiting to test me. Every sound from the street could be footsteps approaching the store. I'd read the same paragraph in my textbook 6 times without absorbing a single word. The door chimed again, and I looked up to see a small child wandering in alone. The kid couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, wearing pajamas and slippers like they'd walked straight out of their bedroom. No parent followed them through the entrance. No car sat running in the parking lot. They moved through the store with the confident steps of someone who belonged there, heading directly toward my counter. Rule 5 surfaced in my memory before the child even opened their mouth. If a child asks if you're hungry, always answer, "No." The kid stopped in front of the register and looked up at me with eyes that seemed too alert for someone their age. "Are you hungry?" "No," I said immediately, keeping my voice steady. "Are you sure?" They tilted their head, studying my face. "You look like you might be hungry." "No, I'm not hungry." The child's expression didn't change, but something shifted in their posture. They asked the same question 3 more times, each repetition carrying more weight than the last. Each time, I gave the same answer, watching as their innocent facade gradually peeled away. When I said no for the 5th time, the child's face went completely cold. The warmth drained from their eyes, leaving something flat and evaluative. They stared at me for another 30 seconds, then turned and walked out of the store without another word. I watched through the windows as they disappeared into the parking lot, moving with the same impossible speed I'd seen from the elderly woman. One moment, they were visible under the streetlights. The next, they'd vanished into darkness that seemed too thick for the available shadows. The encounter left me shaking, not from fear of a child, but from the wrongness of the interaction. The way they'd asked the question, like they already knew the answer. The calculation behind their young features, the sense that my response had determined something important about my continued existence. 3 hours later, just as I was starting to believe I might make it through the rest of the shift without incident, the door chimed again. A man in a brown trench coat and vintage hat entered the store. Everything about him looked like he'd stepped out of a movie from the 1940s. The cut of his coat, the style of his hat, even the way he moved with deliberate, measured steps. He walked directly toward the counter, and I immediately dropped my eyes to the register. Rule 3. Never make eye contact with the man in the brown hat. Stay silent until he leaves. I kept my head down, staring at the cash drawer, while footsteps approached. The man stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could see his shoes, polished leather with old-fashioned laces, close enough to smell something like mothballs and cologne that had been sitting in a closed room for decades. He stood there without moving. I counted my breathing, focusing on the in and out, while resisting the urge to look up. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the hum of the refrigeration units and the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Minutes passed. 5, maybe 10. My neck started to cramp from keeping my head down, but I didn't shift position. Whatever test this was, I was going to pass it by following Gary's rules exactly. Finally, I heard the rustling of paper. Something landed on the counter in front of me, a soft thud that barely registered above the ambient store noise. The footsteps retreated, and the door chimed as the man left. I waited another full minute before looking up. The store appeared empty, no sign of the man anywhere. On the counter sat a piece of paper, crumpled like it had been carried in someone's pocket for a long time. I carefully unfolded it, smoothing out the creases. Written across the paper in red ink was my home address. Nothing else, just the street number, road name, and apartment number, where I'd been sleeping between shifts at this impossible job. My hands trembled as I stared at the address. The handwriting looked old-fashioned, like it had been written with a fountain pen. The red ink seemed to shimmer under the fluorescent lights, almost wet despite the paper's obvious age. I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket next to Gary's rules. The message was clear enough. Whatever was happening at Night Watch Convenience knew where I lived. The job I thought would give me anonymity and distance had somehow made me visible to things that shouldn't exist. Around 4:30 a.m., the elderly woman returned. She shuffled through the entrance wearing the same blue sweater from the previous night, moving with careful steps toward the household goods aisle. I watched her examine the shelves, but this time she reached for a box of tissues that sat clearly within her reach on the second shelf. She made a show of struggling with it anyway, stretching and straining like the box weighed 50 pounds. The performance looked deliberate, like she was giving me an opportunity to demonstrate something. I walked over without hesitation. "Need help with that?" She turned to me with the same knowing smile I'd seen twice before. "Oh, you're such a dear. These old bones just don't work like they used to." I handed her the box of tissues, though we both knew she could have reached it easily. She held it for a moment, examining the label with careful attention. "Perfect," she said. "This is exactly what I needed." But like the previous nights, she set the box back on the shelf instead of buying it. Then she patted my arm with surprising warmth and headed for the door. "You're learning," she said, as she passed the counter. "That's good." I stood in the household goods aisle, processing her words. "You're learning, not learning the job or learning the routine, but learning something deeper." The tests weren't random. They were progressive, each one building on the last. The mirror customer who looked exactly like me, the child asking about hunger, the man in the hat who left threats written in red ink, the elderly woman who needed help with tasks she could handle herself. Each encounter felt more intense because they were more intense. Each rule mattered more because the consequences were becoming clearer. These weren't coincidences or pranks or elaborate hazing rituals. They were examinations, and the grading scale went from passing to dead. I returned to the counter and pulled out Gary's rules, reading them for the 100th time. The words looked different now, not like suggestions or guidelines, but like survival instructions, life or death protocols that someone had learned through experience. I didn't want to imagine. The storage room is your safe space. If anything goes wrong, lock yourself inside and wait for me. Gary's final rule carried new weight after 3 nights of impossible customers and supernatural tests. The storage room wasn't just a place to hide. It was a bunker designed to keep me alive when everything else failed. The rest of the shift passed in tense quiet. I found myself checking the parking lot constantly, looking for shadows that moved wrong, or customers who might be wearing my face. Every normal interaction felt like a gift. Every minute, without beeping or footsteps or knowing smiles, was time borrowed against whatever was really happening at Night Watch Convenience. When Gary returned at 6 a.m., I was sitting behind the counter with his rules spread in front of me like a map of dangerous territory. "Good night," he asked, checking the register. I thought about the child's cold stare, the man's red ink message, the elderly woman's progressive testing, about the growing certainty that I was being evaluated by things that existed outside normal reality. "I followed the rules," I said. Gary nodded, and for the first time, his approval looked genuinely relieved. "That's what matters. The rules aren't just keeping you safe, David. They're keeping everything else contained." I gathered my jacket and walked toward the door, but his words stopped me at the threshold. "Everything else? You'll understand soon enough," Gary said. "Just keep following the rules exactly. No matter what happens, no matter how bad it gets, follow them exactly." I drove home through the morning light, but the sun couldn't burn away the certainty that had settled in my mind. Night watch convenience wasn't just a job, it was a battlefield. And tomorrow night, I'd be back to find out what I was really fighting against. The fourth night felt different before I even got out of my car. The parking lot seemed smaller somehow, like the shadows had crept closer to the building while I was away. The red ink note with my address had spent the day folded in my wallet next to Gary's rules, both pieces of paper feeling heavier than they should. Gary unlocked the door with the same routine as always, but I caught something in his expression when he handed me the keys. Expectation, maybe, like tonight was going to be significant. "Fourth night," he said. "You're getting good at this." I wanted to ask him what happened when someone got too good at following rules that shouldn't need to exist, but he left before I could find the words, disappearing into the morning darkness that still clung to the abandoned storefronts around us. The first hour passed with normal customers, a man buying cigarettes, a woman getting coffee and aspirin. Each ordinary interaction felt like borrowed time, minutes stolen from whatever was waiting to test me again. I'd memorized all 6 rules now, could recite them without looking at the paper, but somehow that felt like preparation for a final exam I wasn't ready to take. Around 11:30 p.m., the child appeared. They pushed through the entrance wearing the same pajamas as before, slippers silent against the linoleum, as they walked directly toward my counter. But something about their posture was different tonight, more confident, like they knew exactly what was going to happen. "Are you hungry?" they asked, stopping in front of the register. "No," I said immediately. "Are you sure?" Their head tilted, studying my face. "You look really hungry." "No, I'm not hungry." But instead of asking a few more times and leaving like the previous night, the child stayed put. They repeated the question again and again, each time with growing intensity. Their voice got louder, more demanding, until they were practically shouting the words at me. "Are you hungry? Are you hungry? Are you hungry? Are you hungry?" I kept answering, "No," like Gary's rule demanded, but the child's expression grew colder with each response. What had started as fake innocence was now openly hostile, their young features twisted into something that belonged on a much older face, something that had seen too much and wanted to share the burden. "Are you hungry?" they screamed, loud enough that the sound echoed off the store walls. "No," I said for what felt like the 20th time. That's when the door chimed again. 2 figures walked through the entrance, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Both looked exactly like me. Same height, same build, same face arranged in precisely the same way. Mirror customers, but now there were 2 of them, moving with coordinated steps, like they'd planned this approach. I tried to speak, to tell them the store was closing like Rule 1 demanded, but the child was still screaming their question at me. The words got tangled in my throat as I watched my own face, duplicated, and walking toward the counter with empty, hollow eyes. "We're closing," I managed to say, my voice barely audible over the child's shouting. "You need to leave." The mirror customers didn't respond. They just kept walking, getting closer to the counter with mechanical precision. Their movements looked synchronized, like they were parts of the same machine designed to look human. "We're closed," I said louder, backing away from the register. "You have to leave now." The child finally stopped screaming, but the sudden silence felt worse than the noise. All three figures stood in my store now. The child in front of the counter, the two mirror customers flanking me on either side. I started moving toward the back of the store, toward the storage room, where Gary's rules said I'd be safe. That's when the man in the brown hat stepped around the corner. He blocked my path to the storage room, standing between me and the only sanctuary the rules had given me. His vintage coat looked even more out of place under the fluorescent lights, and his hat cast shadows that seemed too deep for the available darkness. "You look hungry," he said. His voice hit me like a physical blow. In 3 previous nights, the Hat Man had never spoken. He'd stood silently while I avoided eye contact, then left without a word. But now he was talking, and his words were the same question the child had been screaming. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, following Rule 3, even though everything was falling apart around me. Stay silent until he leaves. Never make eye contact. But he wasn't leaving, and the beeping had started. Electronic chirps filled the store, sharp and rapid like a dozen checkout scanners operating at once. Rule 4 said to go to the storage room when the beeping started, but the Hat Man stood directly in my path. Behind me, I could hear the mirror customers getting closer, their footsteps perfectly synchronized. The beeping grew louder, more chaotic, until it sounded like every electronic device in the store was malfunctioning simultaneously. The child had moved closer too, standing just to my left with that cold expression that didn't belong on a young face. "You look hungry," the Hat Man repeated, and this time there was amusement in his voice. I was trapped, storage room blocked, mirror customers closing in from behind, the child and Hat Man boxing me in from the sides. The beeping reached a crescendo that made my ears ring, and Gary's rules crashed together in my head like contradictory commands from a broken system. Follow Rule 1, tell the mirror customers to leave, but they wouldn't listen. Follow Rule 3, stay silent and avoid eye contact with the Hat Man, but he was blocking my escape. Follow Rule 4, go to the storage room during the beeping, but I couldn't reach it. Follow Rule 5, answer no to the child's questions, but they'd stopped asking. In desperation, with all the rules failing at once, I looked up. The Hat Man's face was everything I'd been told not to see. His smile stretched too wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth that belonged in a shark's mouth, not a human's. His eyes were black holes that seemed to pull light out of the air around them. When our gazes met, his smile grew even wider, showing more teeth than should have been able to fit in any mouth. "There you are," he said, and his voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting a long time for this moment. I ran. All the rules, all of Gary's careful instructions, all the tests I'd passed over 3 nights, none of it mattered anymore. I sprinted toward the front door, pushing past the mirror customers who tried to grab me with hands that felt too cold and too smooth to be real. The door chimed as I burst through it, and I kept running across the parking lot until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. When the engine finally started, I drove to the far edge of the parking lot and stopped, leaving the car running in case I needed to escape completely. Through the store windows, I could see all 4 of them inside: the child, the two mirror customers, and the hat man moving around the aisles like they owned the place. They walked with casual confidence, examining products and interacting with each other like normal customers having a normal shopping experience. But every few minutes, one of them would look toward the windows where I sat in my car. They'd wave, or smile, or make gestures that looked friendly from a distance, but carried undertones of something much darker. The hat man's teeth were still visible, even when he wasn't smiling, white points that caught the fluorescent light. I waited in that parking lot for over 6 hours, watching the impossible customers treat Night Watch convenience like their personal gathering place. Sometimes they'd disappear into the aisles, and I wouldn't see them for long stretches. Other times they'd cluster near the windows, looking out at me with expressions I couldn't read from that distance. Around 4 a.m., the elderly woman joined them. She shuffled through the entrance, wearing her blue sweater, but once inside, her movements became as fluid and confident as the others. She waved at me through the window with the same knowing smile I'd seen 3 times before. The sun was starting to rise when Gary's car pulled into the parking lot. He parked next to the building and walked toward the store entrance, without seeming to notice me sitting in the far corner. I watched him unlock the door and disappear inside. 10 minutes later, he emerged and walked directly toward my car. I rolled down the window, expecting anger or disappointment or demands for explanation. "Rough night?" he asked. I stared at him, trying to process the casual tone. I broke the rules. I looked at the hat man. I ran away from the store. Gary nodded, like this was perfectly reasonable. Sometimes the rules break down. Sometimes running is the right choice. He glanced back toward the store, which now looked completely normal in the morning light. "You handled everything correctly." I abandoned my post. I left the store, unlocked with customers inside. "You survived," Gary said simply. "That's what matters. The store will be fine. It always is." I looked through the windows, but the building appeared empty now. No sign of the child, or the mirror customers, or the man with too many teeth. Just fluorescent lights, buzzing over empty aisles. What happened to them? They went back to wherever they came from. Until next time. Gary checked his watch, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't interpret. "You'll be back tomorrow night." I wanted to say no, wanted to tell him I was done, that I'd find another job somewhere that didn't require memorizing survival rules or staring contests with supernatural entities. But the question in his voice suggested that my answer mattered more than just employment. "Yeah," I heard myself say. Same time, Gary smiled, and for once his face stayed solid and clear, even when I looked away. "Good. Tomorrow will be different." I drove home through the morning traffic, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking until I was back in my apartment with the door locked and the curtains drawn. The red ink note with my address was still in my wallet, and I had the growing certainty that tomorrow night wouldn't just be different, it would be final. I drove to Night Watch Convenience that Thursday night with my resignation letter folded in my jacket pocket, 2 pages of polite professional language thanking Gary for the opportunity and providing standard notice. 5 nights was enough. 5 nights of impossible customers and supernatural tests and rules that kept entities from spreading beyond some invisible boundary I didn't understand. The parking lot looked exactly the same as always. Too much empty asphalt surrounding a building that sat alone among abandoned storefronts, but something felt different as I walked toward the entrance. The air seemed thicker, charged with expectation, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. Gary met me at the door, but I had to look twice to make sure it was him. His face stayed solid and clear, even when I glanced away, no longer blurring from memory like it had every previous night. His features looked more defined, more present, like he'd stepped fully into focus after existing at the edges of perception. "Final night," he said, as he handed me the keys. I stared at him. "How did you know I was planning to quit?" "Because that's what this job does. It pushes people until they make a choice." Gary leaned against the doorframe instead of leaving immediately. "Walk with me." He led me inside, moving past the counter toward the back of the store. I followed, noting how the fluorescent lights seemed steadier tonight, casting fewer shadows between the aisles. Even the muffled quality of sound had lifted, leaving the store feeling more substantial than it had in 4 previous shifts. "Nightwatch convenience exists between things," Gary said, stopping near the storage room door. "Between normal reality and something else. The entities you've been meeting, they can't exist fully in the regular world. Too much light, too much order, too many rules that weren't made for them. So they need places like this, way station, where they can manifest without tearing holes in everything around them." I pulled the resignation letter from my pocket, but didn't unfold it yet. "And the rules, binding agreements, contracts, written in behavior instead of words." Gary touched the storage room door, running his fingers along the wood grain. "Each rule you followed correctly strengthened the boundary between here and everywhere else. Every test you passed proved the system could hold." "What happens if someone breaks all the rules?" Gary looked at me with something that might have been pride. "The boundaries collapse. The entities spread beyond the store, beyond the parking lot, beyond anything that could contain them again. Normal reality gets very abnormal very quickly." I thought about the hat man's rows of sharp teeth, the mirror customer's hollow eyes, the child's cold calculation. Imagined them walking through neighborhoods, appearing in shopping malls, standing in elementary school classrooms. The resignation letter felt heavier in my hands. "How long have you been doing this?" 43 years next month." Gary's voice carried the weight of decades spent maintaining impossible balances. "Started when I was about your age. Thought it was just a night job to pay bills while I figured out my life." He smiled, and the expression looked genuinely warm. "The aging slows down when you accept the position officially, part of the benefits package." I stared at him, doing the math. If he'd started at my age 43 years ago, he should look 20 years older than he did, but his face showed maybe 10 years of wear, like time moved differently around him. Position: manager, guardian, keeper of boundaries. Gary checked his watch. "They'll be here soon." All of them together this time. As if summoned by his words, the door chimed. I turned toward the front of the store, expecting to see the familiar parade of supernatural customers beginning their individual tests. Instead, all 4 entities entered at once. The elderly woman shuffled through first, wearing her blue sweater and moving with the careful steps I'd memorized over multiple encounters. Behind her came the child in pajamas and slippers, no longer radiating the cold hostility from previous nights. The 2 mirror customers followed, their faces exact duplicates of mine, but somehow less threatening now. Finally, the man in the brown hat stepped through the entrance, his vintage coat and polished shoes catching the fluorescent light. But instead of spreading throughout the store to begin their respective tests, they simply stood near the entrance, waiting, like customers in line for service, patient and expectant. "They're not here to test you tonight," Gary said quietly. "You already passed." I looked from the entities to Gary, trying to process what was happening. Past what? Everything. 4 nights of following rules exactly, even when the pressure built beyond what most people could handle. Even when all the protocols broke down at once, you made the right choice by running instead of breaking the binding agreements. through panic or confusion. The elderly woman smiled at me, the same knowing expression I'd seen multiple times, but now it looked approving rather than evaluative. The child gave a small wave, their young features relaxed and friendly. Even the mirror customers seemed less hollow, though their empty eyes still tracked my movements with unnatural precision. The hat man stepped forward, removing his vintage headpiece in a gesture that looked almost formal. With his hat off, I could see his face clearly for the first time, sharp features that belonged in a much earlier era, but human-looking now that his mouth was closed and normal-sized. "We have an offer," he said, his voice carrying none of the menace from the previous night. Gary moved to stand beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his solid, present form. "The position of manager is opening up. I've served my time, maintained the balance, kept the boundaries intact, but the job requires succession. Someone who understands the rules and can enforce them consistently." "What does it mean exactly?" "Protection from aging at normal speed, enhanced awareness of when the boundaries are stressed, the ability to communicate directly with entities instead of following behavioral protocols." Gary gestured toward the group, waiting near the entrance, "and the responsibility of keeping them contained to this space, preventing them from affecting the world beyond these walls." I looked at the entities again, seeing them differently now. Not threats or tests, but residents of a place that existed specifically to contain them. The store wasn't just my workplace. It was their home, their refuge, their prison. What if I say no? You walk out that door and never come back. Find another job, live a normal life, pretend none of this happened. Gary's voice stayed level, but I caught something underneath. Loneliness, maybe, or resignation. "The entities will test whoever replaces you, same as they tested you. Most people don't last past the second night, and if I say yes, you become part of something larger than yourself, something necessary." The elderly woman nodded from across the store, her approval clear even from that distance. "But you never leave. This becomes your world. These become your people. Normal life ends." I thought about my apartment with its unpaid bills and rejection letters, about the job applications that went nowhere, and the future that stretched ahead without direction or purpose, about the red ink note with my address, and the certainty that whatever existed in this store already knew where I lived. Then I thought about Gary's 4 decades of service, maintaining boundaries that kept impossible things from spreading into a world that couldn't handle them, about the careful balance between normal reality and whatever lay beyond it, about the responsibility of keeping everyone else safe from entities that shouldn't exist, but did. The mirror customers moved closer, their movements synchronized but non-threatening. The child walked to the candy aisle and began examining products like any normal kid might do. The elderly woman made her way toward the household goods, though she didn't reach for anything beyond her grasp. Gary extended his hand toward me, palm up. The gesture looked like an invitation and a farewell at the same time. I looked at the resignation letter, still folded in my other hand, 2 pages of polite professional language that would return me to a normal life, filled with ordinary problems and predictable disappointments. Then I looked at the entities moving through the store, like customers who belonged there, no longer testing or threatening, but simply existing in the space that had been created for them. The hat man replaced his vintage headpiece and smiled, his teeth normal-sized and human-shaped. "Take your time," he said. "We're not going anywhere." I folded the resignation letter and slipped it back into my pocket. Then I reached out and took Gary's offered hand, feeling the solid warmth of his grip and the weight of a choice that would change everything about who I was and what my life would become. The entities began their familiar routines throughout the store, but now they looked like family settling in for the evening, rather than supernatural threats, conducting examinations, and standing there with Gary's hand in mine, surrounded by impossible customers in a convenience store that existed between realities. I made my decision.